Well, I think we absolutely must start with a story about Windsor this morning.
Oh.
What happened?
So exciting. I know I should be cooler about this, but I'm not. So when you go in, and I didn't get a sword, but I did get the king. And it's incredibly, everyone makes you feel so special. And I wasn't expecting to be so moved by the whole experience of being a dame and being damed up by the king, or whatever the expression is. I'll get better at that. I got completely overwhelmed. It was extremely embarrassing. And after he did it, and there was a little chat, and then you come off, and the first thing that happened, they went out, there's a very tall, very handsome soldier handed me a box of Kleenex. And I hadn't realised that actually I was crying. Anyway, it was a bit pathetic. And then I got on the underground and I came here. Anyway.
Well, congratulations, and it's a nice segue into what I wanted to explain, that the research is showing that women are poised to shape the future of philanthropy. And we're going to share some data here now. I think Ida Liu earlier today referenced the great generational wealth transfer, but we reported yesterday that in the US alone, women will control $34 trillion, or 38% of investable assets by 2030. That's close to double last year's total. And in Western Europe, women's share of assets under management will rise to 45% by 2030, from about a third now. We know that women of all ages donate more to charity than men, that women tend to give based on empathy, men on self-interest. Women tend to give to multiple organizations. And on top of all of that, we have many female megadonors like Mackenzie Scott, Laurene Powell Jobs, Melinda Gates. So it is a new time for philanthropy. Hannah, I'm going to start with you. Your family has been involved in philanthropy for more than 2 centuries. Mm-hmm. So I just want to ask, from your perspective, how has the model of giving changed, and how do you see it evolving going forward?
It has. I mean, I've been at it right from the get-go, because it was part of the thing that as a family we were encouraged to be involved in philanthropy at a very early age. I mean, that might have been giving a couple of pounds to save Whistle Jacket for the country. That's painting by Stubbs at the National Gallery, or it could have been, doing something in the Village Hall. But in those days, and I am already, as you can probably tell, reasonably old, it was very much, you gave your money away and that was it. But now, of course, there's so many tools. So everything from crowdfunding to blockchain to impact bonds to social bonds to, you name it. And it's a completely different landscape about how you raise money, how you give money away, how you measure it. I mean, we're much more focused, I think, now, this generation, on how you measure impact and how you measure success, which sounds a terrible thing to say in conjunction with philanthropy, but I think a lot of people now are looking at that.
How do you measure?
Well, again, I mean, in a very, very basic way, at the National Gallery, for example, we had to raise £44 million a year from different sources, be it the government, be it private funding, be it incredibly generous grants from people like the Getty. Can I just say, Getty and Bloomberg have been essential to the public institutions of this country. So it's a huge thank you. We really couldn't do it without, and I'm not just saying that, we couldn't do it without these very, very generous donors. So in that case, you can measure it very easily. It could be, for example, there was a thing we were doing with diabetes. You could say to the local government, or the local HMO, which was in Israel, we can reduce the levels of diabetes dramatically by increasing the amount of education about people about what you eat. A lot of people don't understand that what you eat will lower your risk of getting diabetes. So, for example, that's another way you could measure it. But I don't know if you.
Yeah, how do you think of it, Katherine? How do you measure, being the world's wealthiest arts institution? How do you measure your impact?
So I would pick up on something that Hannah said about sort of the way philanthropy used to be and the way that it is now. It's now much more about, sounds corny, but it really is about building relationships. So you have an ongoing connection to the people and entities that you've supported, and that gives you a very good sense of how successful you're being in supporting them. It allows you to adjust what you're doing for them according to their changing needs and strategy. It isn't sort of one and done. Our most successful philanthropic engagements, and a number of them in the UK, are ones that we've had for decades. So that's one way to measure it. And then obviously there are some programs in which it's inherently more measurable. If you're doing a program for young curators from underprivileged backgrounds, and you look at the output 10, 15 years later, you can see very clearly how many people have gone on to have really successful careers of their own. So it's sort of a combination of soft assessment and data.
Katherine, there's been a lot written on the feminization of wealth and what that could mean for becoming more collaborative, more democratic, more altruistic. And I just wonder what your view is on that. Are you seeing that with your own institution? Are you seeing that with your partners?
So I function first and foremost in the arts ecosystem of Los Angeles. More than half of what we do is global, but we're based in Los Angeles. And one thing that is really remarkable about LA is that the majority of major museums are currently run by women. There's sort of a moment, and not just museums, cultural institutions of all sorts, the public radio, all kinds of entities in the greater LA region are run by women. We get together regularly, and I won't reveal what we talk about, but I would hazard a guess that the conversations that we have are not the sort that you might have if it was a group of men or if it was a group of men and women together. And when I arrived in LA 2.5, 3 years ago, I was really moved by the number of women in the sector who reached out to me to say, welcome, let's go out for, they weren't saying, welcome, give me a grant, which was my initial cynical thought. They say, welcome to LA, there's a great group of women here, we're delighted that you're part of it. So there really is a zeitgeist of collaboration that I do think is not exclusive to a women's environment, but certainly is very characteristic of it.
I think, Hannah, you've talked about in the past philanthropy wanting to basically have your name on a building and sort of a more collaborative approach that you're seeing now.
I think it was. I think if you look at when Andrew Carnegie wrote The Gospel of Wealth, way back in the last century, it was very much, that he and that very, very generous, incidentally, generation of American donors, they tended to put their names on buildings. They tended to believe that, and I'm generalizing, but on the whole, it was make as much money as you can and then give it away after your death, or stick it on to buildings, whatever else, which is fine, incidentally. And I'm not saying that there need to be buildings, there need to be edifices, there need to be places to meet. But actually what's happened now, and I don't know whether it's necessarily women being involved or whether it's just society evolving, but I think people are looking at it in a slightly different way. So, for example, thank goodness that's not me, but for example, we contributed to the National Library in Jerusalem, which is an absolutely beautiful building to die for. Herzog de Meuron building, please go if you're there or look at it online. But in addition to actually putting up the building, where you could find our name with a magnifying glass, but more importantly than that, when we gave the building, we actually endowed many, many, many of the programs, something that obviously you're very involved with as well. So it's much more holistic, the way that we're looking at how we give money away. We're not just saying, right, here's a building, get on with it. It's here's a building, this is what we think might happen within it, this is how it could serve society, this is how it could bring readers in or writers in or other people. So it's, I think it's just a different way. I don't know if you found that. It's a different way now of looking at when you endow things and when you fund things.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I spend a fair amount of time thinking about is John Paul Getty, who, of course, is no longer here. He is of the category that you mentioned, a Carnegie-esque figure, but made this spectacularly generous bequest for the creation of an institution that he left the design of the institution completely up to his trustees, and the institution is meant to exist in perpetuity. So I find myself in the interesting position of, on the one hand, being and trying to be a modern philanthropist, a forward-thinking philanthropist, doing things in new ways, but at the same time, it's very important to me that the Getty name be known. Whatever, people say, it's oil money, it's this, it's that, give me a break. Did you want him to, give it away to something less meaningful than the creation of an institution for the dissemination of art? It's important to me that it be known as the Getty. Interestingly, we've become sort of, what is it, a metonym? Like when instead of saying tissue, you say Kleenex. Instead of saying, sticky tape, you say Scotch tape. We've sort of, Getty is now more us than it is him. But I do think a lot about sort of that era of very male, very successful, very I want my name visibly on something philanthropy, and how it can be woven into a completely forward-looking landscape.
I mean, I think that, and why don't we sort of spin that forward then? I mean, you're both somewhat, caught back in tradition, and yet you need to be thinking in innovative ways going forward. So how are you thinking in innovative ways in terms of changing priorities in the future?
Well, again, I'd be really interested to know what you're doing. I mean, obviously, AI is changing absolutely everything. We have a house, Waddesdon Manor, that we look at, which was built by my forebears, and the UK-based foundation looks after. Now, that was a house which was built to entertain the great and the good, and very few, kings, queens, shahs, whatever, blah, blah. And now, we get 400,000 people. But we've got to completely rethink what a visitor attraction, I hate that word, because actually at its core is one of the most beautiful collections imaginable of its type. But so we now have to try and think all the time, well, actually, what does the modern visitor want? And what is our role in the society? What's our role in the community? What's our role in the area? And also, we want people to come. So how do we don't want to kind of move away perhaps from our core purpose, which is excellence and beauty and everything else. But on the other hand, the society's needs are changing. So I find, and I'd like to know what you think, we're constantly trying to imagine or reimagine what we do, but in that sphere of excellence and using technology and using new tools. I mean, how do you look at that?
Well, this is actually very interesting to me that we're talking about this. Just this morning, I had coffee with Nick Cullinan.
Yeah.
And he quoted someone whose name I instantly forgot, but I've remembered the quote, which was, if you want to stay the same, you have to be prepared to constantly change, which perfectly captures this sort of tension. We too, at the Getty in California, at our actual physical site, which includes all of our programs and houses 1,200 staff and is also a museum, we're thinking about what in the States we call the visitor experience. You don't want to become, I love Disneyland, I'm sorry to use it as the example, but there is a Disneyland, we don't want to become that. But we recognize that there are all sorts of people who should feel completely at home in the space of the Getty, whether they have a degree in art history, whether they've ever looked at art before. They have every much of a right to be there as someone who comes up there with their PhD and wants to talk about the difference between Baroque and whatnot. And museums historically haven't done a great job. I think we've all had the experience, I certainly have, of going to look at something and you feel sort of embarrassed because you don't know enough, you don't understand it, you go to read the little thing next to the image and then you feel even less intelligent than you felt before you read it because it invokes 5 other things about which you know nothing. We need to really, really think about the visitor in that context rather than us, our knowledge, our things, and what we're showing. So figuring out how to do that in a way that is true to the mission, but that is completely inviting to the broadest of all possible audiences is something that's very much on our minds as well.
We've talked today, there's been a number of panels that talked about geopolitical risk. I want to talk about the geopolitics in terms of where there are moments where you need to step in as philanthropists. And one example of this is with the Getty in Ukraine. I found this incredibly interesting. If you could explain, Katherine, after the war broke out, what Getty did with the art. Yeah,
absolutely. So our geopolitical engagements are always driven by our commitment to preserving art and cultural heritage. They are not driven by a political position, meaning what's worthy in the situation is the art and the cultural heritage and the preservation thereof. We try to be really clear on that. After the war broke out in Ukraine, we worked with an entity called Aleph, which is a multinational based in Geneva. I actually now sit on their board to enable the taking down of really valuable art and burying it. And the reason it was buried on site, you are probably all aware of the fact that there have been many scandalous instances, most well known during World War II, when art was taken, looted, stolen, in some instances under the guise of, we're going to keep this safe. So we did not want to move it out of the territory. Even there, some people suggested that it be moved to Poland. We didn't want to do that because it could lead to all sorts of other problems down the road. So we participated with others in this scheme to bury art so that it would not be damaged during the war. And in fact, we now know that had we not done this, there are places that have been hit where art would have been destroyed had this not been done. And, we spoke about this a little last night at the cocktail. There are people who don't react well to this. There are people like, well, it's a war. Why aren't you helping save people? To which I guess I have two responses. The anodyne and dry one is, well, my organization is not in the business of, we're not Médecins Sans Frontières, we're not relocating people, that's not what we do. What we do is art. But the more profound and I think genuine response is the most fundamental human product is its cultural output, its artistic output, and to protect that is in a very meaningful way to protect humanity and its past. And some of the most striking work that your family has done, we were just talking backstage about a little tiny synagogue in Crete that exists today in large part because of grants made by your family, and it's a vitally important part of the history of a place and of a people, and that's why protecting these things during war matters, I think, a very good deal.
I mean, there's also war in the Middle East, I know, and I know you do some work in Israel.
Well, we do a lot of work in Israel, and the pillars of what we do, the environment, education, we do lots of work for all communities in Israel, whatever their religion, whatever their past is. And of course, every single person in Israel and every single tree, I'm afraid, just about, has been affected by this appalling war. What do you do in that situation? And meanwhile, the present government, is going to shift a lot of its resources to military, to defence. So if you're supporting people who need support, who might have relied to some extent on government support as well, what do you do as a foundation? Do you then try and step in and take over the role of government? Is that appropriate? Do you shift, for example, an enormous amount of work that we do on coastlines, in keeping coastlines clear? Do you then shift that to forests up on the Syrian border, which have been decimated by bombing, etc., etc.? These are really, really difficult decisions. And I'm not sitting here saying that I know the answers. We are very much trying to think always long term. We're trying to think about the next generation rather than the immediate problem. But clearly there has to be some give and take, and you have to be reactive. We're very lucky that we can be quite reactive. We have a well-resourced foundation. We have a very good reputation. We have fantastic partners. And I think we haven't talked much about partnerships, but my goodness me, let's never underestimate the importance of partners wherever we're working. So, we're feeling our way through, and I think, unfortunately, that's the very best answer I can give, and I suspect you're doing the same. You just try and feel your way through and get as well informed as you possibly can.
It's such important work. We're going to run out of time shortly, and I thought one way to close this is that there's a lot of wealth represented in this room. And I know that you've both started your own foundations. A piece of advice from both of you in terms of if someone here wants to consider setting up their own foundation, what's a piece of advice?
Certainly you want to be strategic and you want to have impact, but you also got to go with your heart. If there's a human being asking you for help and you are moved to help them, I wouldn't get too hung up on whether the outcome is going to be the exact one that you wanted, because once you give something away, it's no longer yours.
I think that's a great answer. I would advise you not to set up a foundation. I think what you can imagine that it produces bureaucratic and other issues. I would say open a CAF account, Charities Aid Foundation, or PRISM. You can do it. You really don't need to put very much in. You can make it tax deductible if you want to do that, which is fine, by the way. And you can then just give to where your heart or your mind or your soul takes you. And I would say this, obviously, I've been lucky enough to be involved in it, but it is probably the single most exciting and rewarding thing that I'm involved with. And that can be however big, however small. And so I'd encourage everybody, as I'm sure you would, just do it. It's fun.
I'm going to need some tissue. Thank you both so much. I just wanted to mention that I do a lot of work with Bloomberg Philanthropies, and I think Gemma mentioned the work that Philanthropies has done with the New Voices initiative, which we've been talking a bit about. Through New Voices, we have already provided funded training, intensive media training, for more than 700 female executives in 16 cities around the world. We are about to, next year, we will launch our 17th city, which will be Milan. So if anyone here is interested in joining us in Milan, Claire Obeson, our program manager, is here, and you can find her also over at the little nook we've set up for New Voices. And we've also, through this work, we have more than tripled our representation of female guests on Bloomberg TV, which was a really important part of why we started the initiative.